The Father's Day steakhouse dinner was packed, and every eye in the room was fixed directly on me. My father, a powerful real estate mogul, stood at the head of the long family table, his voice booming across the restaurant as he threw my gift envelope into my face. 25 years old, and this worthless piece of paper is all you can offer me, he roared, laughing cruelly with my golden child siblings. You've always been a disappointment. Humiliated, with tears stinging my eyes, I forced myself to remain completely silent. I simply nudged the envelope back toward his trembling hands and told him to open it. The smug grin on his face slowly vanished as his fingers tore the paper apart. The moment he pulled out the document inside, his face turned ash-white, his knees buckled, and he screamed a sound of pure terror that silenced the entire restaurant. My name is Valera. For as long as I can remember, I have been the ghost at my own family's feast. My father, Garrick, is a man whose name carries immense weight in the luxury real estate market. A ruthless billionaire who measures a person's worth entirely by their net worth and their willingness to bow to his whims. To him, my golden child brother, Quinton, and my superficial sister, Mireia, were extensions of his own grand ego. They joined his corporate empire straight out of college, learning the art of the cutthroat deal. But I chose a different path, quietly working my way up through corporate compliance and asset law, away from his shadow. Because of this, Garrick treated me like an absolute outcast. This Father's Day was no exception. We were gathered at the city's most exclusive high-end steakhouse, surrounded by wealthy investors and flashing diamonds. Quinton had just presented our father with the keys to a custom-imported European sports car, and Mireia had gifted him a rare, historical gold watch. Garrick basked in their shallow adoration, laughing loudly and draining his expensive wine, completely ignoring my presence at the very end of the long mahogany table. He loved the competition he created between us, fueling a toxic family dynamic where loyalty was bought and affection was earned through corporate numbers. I sat there calmly, adjusting my blazer, watching my siblings smirk at me. They thought I had shown up empty-handed to the execution of my own reputation. But I wasn't empty-handed at all. As the waiters cleared the main course, the heavy silence at my end of the table became impossible for Garrick to ignore. He leaned back in his leather chair, his sharp eyes locking onto me with familiar disdain. "Well, Valera," he boomed, his loud voice cutting through the ambient chatter of the crowded restaurant. "Are you just here to eat my food, or did you actually bring your father something to mark the occasion?" Quinton snickered into his napkin, and Mireia took a slow sip of her champagne, leaning forward to enjoy the show. Every eye in the elite establishment shifted toward me. I didn't flinch. I reached into my bag, pulled out a plain, unadorned white envelope, and slid it smoothly across the pristine white tablecloth. It looked pathetic resting next to the luxury car keys and the glittering gold watch. Garrick didn't even pick it up. Instead, his face darkened with immediate, aggressive disgust. With a cruel laugh, he flicked the envelope back into my face. It struck my cheek before falling onto my plate. 25 years old, and a cheap piece of paper is all you can offer a man of my stature, he roared, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. You've always been a pathetic disappointment, Valera. No ambition, no drive. You are an embarrassment to the family name. The humiliation was a physical weight in the room, and a few patrons at neighboring tables whispered in shock. My siblings grinned openly, basking in my public execution. Tears stung the corners of my eyes, but I forced my breathing to remain perfectly steady. I didn't yell. I didn't run. I simply picked up the envelope, nudged it back into his trembling hands, and looked him dead in the eye. Garrick's fingers gripped the edges of the white paper, his knuckles white as he stared back at me, waiting for me to break down or apologize for my existence. The entire restaurant had gone completely quiet, the ambient noise fading into a tense, suffocating vacuum. He raised the envelope high, preparing to tear it in half and throw it on the floor to finish his grand performance of dominance. But I didn't break. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table, and whispered a single sentence that cut through his towering rage. "If you don't open that right now, Dad, it will be the last executive decision you ever make." "I am glad to have you here," Follow my story until the end and comment the city you are watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. Watching my father look down at me with such absolute disgust, I knew that what he was about to read would change our family dynamics forever. He thought he was destroying me, but he was about to realize he had just destroyed himself. The trap was sprung, and he was holding the trigger. Garrick sneered, his mouth twisting into a mocking line as he aggressively ripped the top off the envelope. He expected a cheap, handwritten card, a dramatic poem, or perhaps a pathetic request for a corporate loan. But as his thick fingers pulled out the heavy, cream-colored document inside, his smug grin froze. It wasn't a card. It was a certified, legally binding federal court decree, stamped with the official seal of the state's highest judicial branch. To understand why this paper was so devastating, you have to know a secret about my family's empire. For the past 3 years, while my father dismissed me as a useless corporate compliance lawyer, I had been quietly auditing the chaotic foundation of his real estate kingdom. I discovered that over a decade ago, during a massive tax evasion scare, Garrick had illegally transferred the primary land deeds of his entire empire into my late mother's private asset trust. He believed he could control that trust forever through a series of complex shell companies and proxy voters. What he completely overlooked, however, was the ironclad indemnity clause my mother had secretly written into the original framework before she passed away. The clause was simple but absolute. Upon my 25th birthday, the entire trust would automatically undergo emergency liquidation and transfer 100% of its asset ownership, voting rights, and corporate control directly to me. My 25th birthday was yesterday. While my siblings were busy picking out luxury sports cars and gold watches to stroke his massive ego, the federal courts were finalizing the asset execution. The paper Garrick was holding wasn't a request for his approval. It was a formal notification of a complete corporate takeover. Every single building, every bank account, and every piece of property he claimed to own no longer belonged to him. It belonged to the daughter he had just humiliated. The full reality of the legal document crashed into Garrick all at once. The color drained from his face so fast he looked like a corpse sitting at the head of the table. His hands began to shake violently, the heavy cream paper fluttering in his grip as his eyes scanned the official judicial stamps over and over again. He tried to speak, to yell, to regain his terrifying posture, but his throat seized. Instead, a blood-curdling scream of pure, unadulterated panic escaped his lips, a raw, broken sound that echoed sharply across the crowded dining room, causing several patrons to gasp in shock. In his frenzy, his elbow slammed into his crystal wine glass, sending it crashing to the floor where it shattered into 100 glittering pieces, staining the pristine carpet blood red. Garrick's knees literally buckled beneath the table, and he sank heavily into his chair, clutching his chest as if he couldn't breathe. This is a forgery," he choked out, his booming voice reduced to a pathetic, high-pitched gasp. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with a terrifying vulnerability I had never seen before. "Valera, what have you done? You can't do this to me." Quinton's smug grin instantly vanished. He jumped to his feet, grabbing the paper out of our father's trembling hands. Mireia leaned over his shoulder, her face twisting into horror as they read the decree together. The realization hit them like a physical blow. Their faces turned completely pale as they looked from the document to me, suddenly realizing that their multi-million-dollar inheritances, their bloated salaries, and their entire lavish lifestyles had just completely vanished into the hands of the sister they had spent their entire lives mocking. I stood up slowly, smoothing the wrinkles from my blazer, completely dominating the very room that had just echoed with laughter at my expense. The power dynamic at the table had shattered instantly. I looked down at my father, whose breathing was shallow, and then at my siblings, who looked like they were staring at a firing squad. "It is not a forgery, Quinton," I said, my voice calm, level, and entirely devoid of the anger they expected. "And I am not here to destroy the company. I am here to correct a lifetime of bad management." I rested my palms on the edge of the table, leaning in slightly so every word carried the weight of my new authority. I laid out the immediate restructuring terms. Effective tomorrow morning, Garrick was completely stripped of his executive voting power and removed from the board of directors, placed into a mandatory, non-operational advisory role. As for Quinton and Mireia, their bloated corporate salaries and corporate credit cards were frozen instantly. If they wanted to keep their offices, they would have to reapply for junior associate positions and actually work for a living, reporting directly to me. Mireia opened her mouth to screech a protest, but the sheer coldness in my eyes cut her off before she could make a sound. Garrick just stared at his plate, completely defeated, a broken king in a ruined kingdom. I picked up my purse, looked around at the stunned silence of the elite establishment, and walked out into the cool evening air, leaving my family sitting in the absolute ruins of their own arrogance. Walking out of that restaurant, the cool night air felt like the first breath of true freedom I had taken in 25 years. I had walked into that steakhouse as the dismissed, humiliated daughter, but I left it as the sole protector of my mother's true legacy. For years, my family believed that cruelty was a form of strength and that money gave them the right to crush anyone they deemed beneath them. They learned the hard way that arrogance always borrows time it can never afford to pay back. Today, the family empire operates under strict, transparent legal compliance, and my siblings are finally learning the value of an honest day's work. Now, I am curious about all of you who listen to my story. What would you have done if your own father tried to publicly humiliate you? Would you have taken everything, or given them a second chance? Comment below.